Hello, and welcome back to After Almost 2 Years of Absence. I'm going to try this in a different format since I am spiffily dressed, and we're going to get back into it. Star Wars, Republic Commando, Hard Contact. We left off on Chapter 5, and we are going to dive into Chapter 6. And without further ado, let us continue. Excuse me. You want to know how clones tell each other apart? Who cares? They're here to fight, not to socialize. Sergeant Cal Scarata. Get out, Burhan yelled. Get out and don't come back. You've brought all of this on us. Go on, clear off. The farmers shied of a clod of dirt at Etain, and she sidestepped it. It broke into dust behind her. The old woman, who wasn't Burham's wife, she discovered, came up from behind and grabbed his arm. Don't be a fool, she said. If we take care of the Jedi, then they'll take care of us when the Republic comes. Burhan was still staring at Etain as if he were debating whether to go and grab his pitchfork. Republic, my rump, he said. There's no difference to Nemes when it comes to it. We'll still be bottom of the pile, whoever runs the show. Etain stood with her arms folded, wondering how the old woman, Jinart, had managed to attach herself to Burhan's sprawling family. She was an appalling cook and couldn't have been much help with the heavy farm labor. Etain imagined she earned her keep spinning merely wool like the rest of the elderly Killarans she'd met. But right now, Etain doubted even Jinart's powers of persuasion. She decided to try her own again. Burhan, you want me to stay, she said carefully, concentrating as Master Fullier had taught her. You want to cooperate with me. I rotten well don't want to cooperate with you, missy, he said, and say, please. She never quite mastered Jedi persuasion when under stress. Unfortunately, that was always the time when she needed it. Janart nudged Burnham roughly. No mean feat for such a short woman. If them Jedi had landed, fool, then she'll bring them around here to sort you out, she said. This is no time to make new enemies, and if they haven't, well, it'll all blow over, and then you'll have someone who can make things grow. That's right, isn't it, girl? Jedi can make crops grow. Etain watched the display of rustic logic and growing respect. We can harness the Force to nurture plants, yes. That was all too true. She had heard stories of Padawans joining the Agri Corps when they didn't perform well during training. That was all she needed. Life on a backwater planet, talking to fields of grain. It wasn't just the intelligence data she had hidden in her cloak that made her want to get off the planet as fast as she could. Agriculture spelled failure. She didn't need further reminding of her inadequacy. Yeah, Burhan spat and trudged off, muttering profanities. We all get nervous when Hokin's thugs start burning down farms, Janart said. She took Etain's arm and steered her back to the barn that had become her home. No, it wasn't home. There could never be home for her. No loves, no attachments, no commitments, except the Force. Well, at least it wouldn't be so hard to tear herself away from here. And killing farmers, of course. So, why aren't you nervous? Etain asked. You're cautious, child. I have a dead master. It encourages you somewhat. I have a broader view of life, Janart said. Not at all like a wool-spinning old woman. Now you keep yourself safe and don't go wandering about. Etain was developing a Nemodian level of paranoia, and had wondered if even her own instincts were deceiving her. She had at least always been able to sense another's emotions and condition. So, they know where to find me? She said quietly, testing. Janart stiffened visibly. Depends on who They might be, she said, wafting the pungent scent of Merle as she walked. I don't care much for Urquhart much, and at my time of life there's little left to covet. You said they were coming. Indeed, I did. I have no patience for your riddles. Then you should have. And you should also be reassured because they're here and they'll help you. But you also need to help them. Etaine's mind raced, her stomach knotted. No, she was falling for carnival fortune teller's tricks. She was adding her own knowledge and senses to vague generalities and seeing meaning where there was none. Of course, Janart knew strangers had arrived. The whole Imbrani had known it. Master Fullier, and it was very hard not to know something had happened when vessels crash landed on your farm, and when every hiding hole in the area was being searched by Hokin's militia. For some reason or other, Janart was playing a guessing game. When you specify something, I'll take you seriously, Etain said. You should be less suspicious, Janart said slowly, and you should look at what you think you see much more carefully. Etain opened the barn door and the scent of straw and bark tumbled out, almost solid. She felt suddenly calmer and even hopeful. She had no idea why. Perhaps Janart was naturally reassuring, as comforting as a grandmother, despite all her odd talk. Etain couldn't actually remember a grandmother, or any of her biological family, of course. Family wasn't familiar or soothing because she had grown up in a commune of Jedi novices, educated and raised and cared for by her own kind. And by that, she never meant human. But family, even from what she had briefly of the squabbling farmers' clans, suddenly seemed desirable. It was difficult to be alone right then. I wish I had time to educate you in survival, Janart said. That task will have to be fall to someone else. Be ready to come with me when it gets dark. Janart was becoming more articulate. She was more than what she appeared to be. Etain decided to trust the old woman because she was the nearest she had to an ally. She still had her lightsaber, after all. Darman came to the edge of the wood and found himself facing an open field the size of Camino's oceans. It seemed like it, anyway. He couldn't see the boundary of either side of him, just straight across where the trees began again, the rows of grain, steel gray, shining, sighing in the wind, were only waist high. He was 30 click east of RV Gamma, desperate to reach it and get some sleep while waiting for the rest of his squad. Following the cover of the hedge, wherever that may take him, would cost him a lot of time. He opted to take the direct route. He removed one of the 3 micro remotes from his belt pack and activated it. The tiny viewing device was about the size of a pygmy Hummer, small enough to grasp in the palm, and he set it to scout the area for 5 kilometers around him. He didn't like using them unless he absolutely had to. On a planet like this, the shiny metallic coating was hardly geared towards stealth. They also had a tendency to go missing, and because they recorded as well as transmitted, they were one of the last things he wanted to let fall into the enemy's hands. But he wasn't exactly invisible either. He glanced down at his filthy armor, streaked with dried mud, wet green moss, and far, far worse. And he knew he was still a big plastoid ally industrial object in a gentle organic environment. He lowered himself onto all fours, adjusting his balance carefully so the pack sat squarely down the length of his back. His knees still hurt. Crawling through a field wasn't going to help it. The sooner you get there, the sooner you rest. The remote soared vertically into the air, playing back a rapidly shrinking view of the field and then a wider landscape of the farmland and woods, all within Darman's visor display. There were no buildings as far as he could see. That didn't necessarily mean the area was deserted. Crawling with his packs generated a lot of heat, but the bodysuit regulated it obediently. The armor system had more pluses than disadvantages. He didn't want to worry about wildlife waiting to bite, sting, poison, affect, or otherwise ruin his entire day. But it was slow going. He had to loop wide if he was going to avoid the little town and Brawny. In fact, the whole day had been one of the slow progress, although the only timetable he could latch onto was that of his comrades and how long it would take them to get to RV Gamma. Then he would move on if he didn't show by the appointed time. After, well, after that, well, after that, they were off the chart, so to speak. It would be a matter of regrouping and gathering enough intel to take the target. Darman suspected it would take longer than a few days. A lot longer. He had started making notes of what local flora and fauna might be edible and the positions of springs and watercourses that hadn't shown up in the high altitude recce. He wondered if the Dans made a decent eating. He reckoned it might not be worth trying. Every so often he paused to kneel and sip some water from his bottle. His stomach fantasies were no longer of sizzling nerve strips, but a sweet, filling, sticky amber ooge cake. It was a rare treat. His training sergeant had allowed his squad, his original squad, to try it, breaking the Kaminoan rules on feeding clones carefully balanced natural nutritional mixes. You're still just boys, he told them. Fill your boots. And they had. Good old Cal. The flavor was still archivingly vivid in Darman's mind. He wondered what other normal civilian indulgences he might enjoy if he had access to them, The flavor was, He slapped the thought down hard. His discipline was his self-esteem. He was a professional. He still thought about the ooge cake, though. Come on, get moving, he said, very tired of the absence of his comrades' voices seeking comfort in his own. He would be his commanding officer, just to stay sharp. Shift it. The remote continued to relay predictable images of bucolic peace. Neat patchworks of fields punctuated by the wild tangled woods. Reminders of an unsettled and untamed world. There were no giant harvester droids out yet. At one point, he thought he saw a dark form moving across the field at some way to his left, but he focused on it, and it was simply a gap opened by the wind. Then there was a sudden patch of darkness in his visor. Darman stopped dead. The thing had malfunctioned. But the image returned, glowing red and wet, and he realized he was looking into the digestive tract of a living creature. Something had swallowed the remote. A few moments later, a large bird, slowly flapping four wings, sailed overhead and cast an alarming shadow before him. He glanced up. It was probably the same kind that had struck into the Narcissus sprayer's Atmos engine. I hope it gives you a gut ache, you scumbag, he said, and waited for it to dwindle to a black speck before moving on. It took more than half an hour to reach the other side of the field, and he still had 25 clicks to get to the RV point. He decided to go north on the town, although he shouldn't have risked moving at all, by day at all. Get there early, wait for them, just in case they decide I'm dead and they don't hang out. He eased into the bushes, scattering small creatures that he could hear but not see, and considering taking off his packs just for a moment's relief. But he knew that would make it much harder to move when he slotted them back into place again. Exhausted, he fumbled into his belt for a ration cube and chewed, willing the nutrients to hit his bloodstream as fast as they could. Before he slumped into sleep and didn't get up again, lights danced in front of his eyes. Fatigue was giving him heads-up display of its own. The last of the cube dissolved in his mouth. "Oh, come on, soldier, haul it up," he said. Playing mind games could keep him going. The trick was to remember the game ended and then snap back to reality. Right then, he decided to let his commander self shout him into action. "Sir," he said, and sprang up from a kneeling position in on the move. He trotted slightly when his knees locked out, but he stayed upright and leaned against a tree. He made a mental note that he needed to keep better hydrated. It was so dark in the wood that his night vision kicked in from time to time, superimposing ghostly green images of the trunks and branches. He'd grown used to the range of animal sounds. An occasional whisper of leaves or snap of twigs blended into the pattern of what his brain was cataloging as NFQ, normal for Culora. From time to time, a slightly abnormal snap or rustle would make him drop to a squat and turn, rifle ready. But he was clear. He followed the river on his holo chart for part of the way. Although it was actually more of a stream, the faint trickle of the liquid over the rocks was reassuring in the way that the sound of water could be, and after an hour he came back upon a break in the tree canopy that allowed sunlight to filter down on the stream in slanted shafts. Brilliantly colored insects circled and danced above the surface. Darman had never seen anything quite like this. Yes, he knew all about geological formations and what they foretold for soldiers: sources of water, treacherous scree, risk of landslide, caverns to shelter in, high grounds for defense, passes to block. Accelerated Learning packaged the natural world for him and explained how he could use it to his military advantage. But nobody told him it looked so nice. He had no words for it. Like the ooge cake, it was a glimpse of another world that wasn't his. "Sit down and rest. You're too tired. You'll start making fatal mistakes." It was weakness talking. He shook his head rapidly to clear it. No stims. No, not yet. He had to press on. The insects kept up a constant circuit of the stream like Recce aircraft circling, seeking. "You're hours ahead. Stop. No, sleep makes you careless. You can't afford to be careless." It did sound like common sense. It wasn't the game voice, his imaginary commander, giving him orders. It felt deep within him, instinct, and it was right. He was making slower and slower progress, and he had to concentrate on putting one foot in front of the other. He stopped and unclipped one pack, then the other. It was a good enough place to camp. He filled his water bottle and hauled a few half-decayed logs into place to build a defensive sangar, just like Sergeant Cal had taught him. It wasn't only a low defensive circle of rocks or whatever came to hand, but it made a difference on a battlefield when you couldn't dig in. He sat in the walled hollow he created, staring at the water. Then he cracked the seal on his helmet and breathed unfiltered air for the first time in many hours. It smelled complex. It wasn't the air conditioning of Tepoka City, and it wasn't the dry, dead air of Geonosis. It was alive. Darman released all the gription panels on his armor and stacked the plates inside the circle of the sangar. Set his helmet to detect any movement and left it on the makeshift wall. Then he peeled off his bodysuit section by section and rinsed it in the flowing water. The day was surprisingly warm. He had no way of telling what it felt like while he was sealed in the suit, just the ambient environmental data on his display. But the water was shockingly cold when he'd stepped in. He washed quickly, sat in a pool of sunlight to dry off, and then replaced the panels of his bodysuit. They dried out a lot more quickly than he had. Before he let himself nod off, he put his armor back on. There was no sense of getting used to this pleasant sensation of not wearing it. It was drilled so thoroughly into him that he was surprised he thought otherwise even for a second. In enemy territory, you slept in full kit, with your blaster ready. He cradled his rifle in his arms, leaned back on his pack, and watched the insects dancing on the sunlit water. They were so hypnotically beautiful. Their wings were electric blues and bright vermilion, and they wove a figure eight. Then, one by one, they dropped down and floated on the surface, drifting with the current, still wonderfully vivid, but now apparently dead. Darman reacted. Airborne toxin. He shut his eyes tight, puffed out the air in his lungs, and snapped his helmet back into place, drawing breath again only when the seal was secured and his filtration mask could take over, but there was no date on his visor to indicate a contaminant. The air was still clean. He leaned out and scooped up a couple of the insects caught in the eddy. One kicked a leg a few times and then was still. When he looked up, there were none left flying. It seemed sad. What bothered him more was that seemed inexplicable. Curious, he fumbled for an empty ration cube container and dropped the insects into it to consider them later. Then he closed his eyes and tried to doze, rifle ready. But sleep eluded him. His helmet detected movement and woke him every 5 minutes at the intrusion of small creatures, no threat to him. Once or twice it picked up a Dan, and he opened his eyes to see glittering points of reflected light staring back at him. The system picked up something larger once, but it wasn't as large as any humanoid in his database, and kept its distance before disappearing. Oh, get some sleep. You're gonna need it, son. Darman wasn't sure if it was his own voice or the voice of his imaginary commander. Either way, it was an order, and he was willing to obey. Gaz Hoken never took kindly to being summoned, but Ovalot Queluthon had the gift of being charming about it. She invited him to meet her in the research complex. She even sent one of her staff with a speeder to collect him from his offices. Hokan appreciated the gesture. The woman understood how to use power and influence. The Nemodian grocer had yet to learn. Uthon was not particularly pretty, but she did have a knack for dressing well, in plain dark robes and carrying herself like an empress. That balanced the scales. What Hokan liked most about her was that she seemed to know the feminine charm wouldn't override his common sense. She never dropped her seductively reasonable facade. She was a professional, and mutual respect went a long way with him. The fact that she was a scientist with subtle political skills impressed him further still. He could almost forgive the unnatural act of fighting without real weapons. The decaying exterior of farm buildings gave way to reinforced allied doors in lengthy corridors with what appeared to be emergency bulkheads. Hokan carried his helmet under one arm, unwilling to leave it, or his weapons with the servant. The wizened man looked local. The locals were all thieves. Expecting some grain silo fires, then, he said, and produced the recessed blast bulkheads with his forefinger. Uthon laughed a low, tinkling laugh that he knew could just as easily switch to a commanding voice and freeze a parade of ground troops. I'm grateful you could make the time to see me, General Hokan, she said. Under normal circumstance, I would never bypass someone with whom I had a contract and speak directly to his subcontractor. It's very rude, don't you think? But I'm a little concerned. Ah, Kit wasn't part of this conversation. Hokan began to understand, and she was laying on the flattery with a trowel. I'm merely Hokan, a citizen. Let me address your concerns, madam. He felt suddenly foolish. He had no idea what to call her. Mistress Uthon? Doctor will be fine, thank you. How can I reassure you then, Doctor? She steered him into the side room and indicated three shimmering beige brassard upholstered chairs, clearly imported from Coruscant. He hesitated to sit on such a conspicuously decadent seat, but he did because he didn't want to stand before her like a servant. Uthon took the chair nearest to him. You have some idea of the importance of the work I carry out here, I think. Not in any detail. Viruses, from the building specification anyway. He'd police the construction crews, who were also all thieves. Hazardous materials? If Uthon was surprised, she gave no indication whatsoever. Exactly, she said, and I confess I'm somewhat disturbed by the events of recent days. Lick and Kit assures me my security is guaranteed, but I would really welcome your assessment of the situation. Her tone hardened just a fraction. Still syrup, but now with gritty, sharp crystals in it. Is this project under any threat, and can you maintain its security? Hoken didn't hesitate. Yes, I believe your facility is vulnerable. He was a master of his trade. He saw no reason to lose his reputation over a restriction not of his making. And no, I can't guarantee anything with the level of quality of staff that I have. Uthon sat back with controlled slowness. Last matter first. Do you not have the resources to employ them? Ankit's contract is quite generous. That generosity has not filtered down to my operation. Ah, well, perhaps we should shorten the supply chain in the interest of efficiency. I have no opinion on that. Ankit's welcome to cut his up. Ankit's welcome to his cut, as long as I have the tools to do the job. That wasn't quite the cut I had in mind for Lick Ankit, she smiled. There was no warmth in it, though. And you believe the recent incursions are related to this facility? Circumstantial evidence. Yes. Hoken returned the smile and suspected his was a few degrees cooler. If she'd do this to Ankit, she'd do it to him. It's a big planet. Why the Embrani region? Why send Jedi agents? Have you located any forces? No, I just identified at least 2 points of hard contact and one down vessel, though. Hard contact. Situations when soldiers actually engage each other. Not that his rabble of mercenaries rated the distinction of soldiers. I can't gauge numbers. If I were to arrange for you to command of a separatist. Ooh, hold on, let me change the accent there. I can't gauge numbers. If I were to arrange for you to have command of separatist droids and their officers from our nearby garrison, would that make your task easier? I take no sides. I won't lie to you and pretend to support your cause. You have military experience, of course. There's no disgrace in being a mercenary. I'm Mandalorian. It is in my soul as well as part of my education. No, there's no shame in it as long as you give of your best. Uthon suddenly melted in what seemed to be a thoroughly genuine and sympathetic half smile. I think I should share something with you. It might be distressing. There were still hard edges in her unctuous tone. The Republic has created an army of cloned troops. Millions. They have been bred to fight and serve Jedi generals without question, altered to be their willing servants. They have no normal life and they age very rapidly. If they survive being wasted in foolish battles, do you know whose genetic material was used to create these unfortunate slaves? No, I don't. Hoken was never embarrassed to admit ignorance. That was for small men. Tell me.
Jango Fett.
What?
Yes, the finest Mandalorian warrior of his day has been used to churn out cannon fodder for the aggrandizement of the Jedi. If she had spat in his face, he couldn't have been more appalled. He knew she was aware of what that would enrage him. She used the emotional term warrior, not bounty hunter. She knew how much the relation would offend his cultural pride, but she was right to tell him. It was a matter of honor, and more than his own. He would not see his heritage used in a travesty of honest war.
I'd take the contract even if you didn't pay me, he said.
Uthan seemed to relax.
We can give you up to 100 droids to start with.
Ask if you need more. It's a small garrison because we didn't want to attract attention. But now that we have that attention anyway, we can reinforce if necessary. What about your existing militia?
I think layoff notices might be in order. Perhaps your troops might start helping me with the administration of that.
Uthan blinked for a second and Hoken realized she had taken longer than usual to understand what he meant. She'd grasped the meaning. I can be as ruthless as you. She'd think twice before undermining him, and she was undermining Ankit. That might be a sensible start, she said.
Hoken stood up and held his helmet in both hands. He had always been proud of that tradition. Proud that it hadn't changed in thousands of years, except for the technical enhancement here and there. What really mattered was what lay under the Mandalorian armor. A warrior's heart.
Would you like to know what virus we're developing here, Major Hoken? Uthan asked. So he had a real rank now, not flatteringly extravagant general.
Do I need to?
I think so. You see, it's specifically for the clones.
Let me see. To make them proper men again?
Nothing can do that. This is to kill them.
Hoken replaced his helmet carefully. The kindest solution, he said, and meant it.
And that wraps up Chapter 6 of Star Wars Republic Commando Hard Contact. See you next time.